very generous introduction, and yeah, I'm incredibly grateful and happy to be here because Dame Kate Barker really needs no introduction. But I think Ben's point about the 2004 review that she oversaw into housing supply is key. You know, it was a really seminal piece of work, and I've been lucky enough to speak to Kate in the last year about the housing crisis as it's unfolding, and I have found her thoughts incredibly insightful, and I'm sure you will too. So I wanted to begin, Kate. You and I had a bit of a chat last week, and I wrote some of it up, and you said something that really struck me, which is that in 2004, when you published the review under Tony Blair's Labour government, you didn't think that the housing crisis would get to the stage that it is at now. Could you just tell everybody a bit about what you meant by that and how different the landscape is today?
Well, I mean, 20 years is a long time ago, and trying to put myself back in those shoes isn't entirely easy. But I think I was really optimistic at the time. The government was then very committed to pushing housing supply up. They had put in place, I mean, people look back at it now and think it wasn't very successful, but they put in place a regional structure for planning that really made an effort to draw together the provision of infrastructure and housing and really think about this on a big scale. There was quite a commitment to pushing up the supply of social housing. And generally, you know, I don't think I was naive enough to think you were going to solve every problem. You're never going to solve every problem in the housing system. I mean, a good question you should always be asking is, what has to happen to make you say we're not in a crisis? Because if you go back 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you can always find people saying we're in a crisis, you know, right back notoriously to Cathy Come Home, where the crisis was felt in different places. But I really hope that the review and the government response to it would make things better. And 20 years on, to be looking at a stock of social renting, which has barely changed from 20 years ago, despite the fact I think there's evidence of rising need, to see a rise in the number of households living in overcrowded accommodation, to see a rise, perhaps most disturbingly of all, of households in temporary accommodation, which is such a bad place for children to be brought up, is just very, you know, it's just very disappointing. So it's hard to say that one thing, you know, that one thing went wrong, although the global financial crisis was probably the biggest challenge that this project faced.
Absolutely. And I think the landscape now is, you know, the private rented sector has doubled. It's harder and harder for young people to access home ownership. We're simply not building enough social homes or homes for private sale. The global financial crisis always seems to me in my reporting as a real turning point. What do you think it did to the housing market in Britain? And as a sort of part B to that question, where do you think governments went wrong in their response?
There are actually some quite good responses to the financial crisis. Let's try and split this up a bit. The reason I think the global financial crisis was such a disaster for housing is because the housing industry at the time, and perhaps this is partly my fault, was very geared up to increasing supply. And in order to do that, house builders had really run down their balance sheets. And consequently, when they went into the financial crisis, they were in really quite a vulnerable state. And that meant that coming out of the crisis, the collapse in the construction industry had all sorts of effects, because these skills and the abilities to find sites, to make sites work, doesn't just happen overnight. We all know how long it takes. So it really took a long time for the industry to get back on its feet and actually have the confidence and the balance sheet to start growing their output again. So that, I think, was very seminal. But alongside it, there were two things that happened that government did, perhaps three actually, sorry, nobody expects Spanish things. That's three things. The first is the decision to take away the regional tier of planning. As I say, not everybody thought that was successful, but its removal has certainly made it more difficult to do something which was difficult anyway, which was to ensure that planning for infrastructure, transport, water, health was really coordinated with where housing was going to go. And that's quite hard to do on a local authority level. It's also quite hard even to do environmental planning in very small areas. Environmental planning, if you're thinking about flood risk, how you're going to manage that. These are big areas, river basins are, whole things, and they run through many local authorities. So losing the regional tier was, I think, one problem. The good thing that government did, however, was to introduce the first NPPF, which really simplified a whole bundle of, whole mass of planning regulation that had existed before. And that was very positive. And I think without that, we would have had a more difficult time. But I suppose the other thing I would regret was cutting back on the social housing programme, which had been expanded in the years immediately following the 2004 review. But since then, after that was cut back, particularly in the early years of the coalition government. And it has never really recovered.
It's really interesting. I'll pick up on infrastructure in a moment, but let's talk about social housing for a second. You and I have previously spoken about why it might have been a good idea for government to use low interest rates to encourage social house building. We're living through a moment that reminds us how cyclical economic cycles can be. Do you think we need some kind of consensus on social house building as a key pillar of indemnifying us against these cycles? Because you mentioned rising temporary accommodation. I go into those buildings and see the conditions children are living in, and it frankly just shouldn't be happening. And if we had enough social housing, not only would that rent be going back into the system, those kids wouldn't be in those converted office blocks, shipping containers, homes that I wouldn't wish on anyone.
Yeah. And indeed in hotels where the facilities are very inadequate. Do I think it was a missed opportunity? 2020 hindsight's such a great thing. I mean, with 2020 hindsight, the ability of the government to borrow at relatively low interest rates right through the 2010s was a big missed opportunity to try and put in place some long-term plans for infrastructure. To be fair to governments, at the beginning of the 2020s, I don't think anybody expected the period of very low interest rates to last quite so long. And since putting in place infrastructure takes time, you'd have had to sort of start thinking about it right at the beginning when you didn't know that the financial circumstances were going to be so favourable. So it's easy now to say that this is a missed opportunity, but at the time, I guess it wasn't so obvious. My view, however, is that the real problem was that government, and it's not really just about government spending, government thought and that it was better in a way to shift people into the rental market and to really develop the affordable rent product. But that has, of course, turned out to be very expensive. The housing benefit bill has just spiraled and spiraled. And that tells you something that probably we all should know, is that when housing gets more expensive, it's much more difficult for people at the bottom to access it. And if you want them to access decent housing, you actually just need bigger and bigger subsidies. So if you can't, in some ways, think about the private bit of the housing market, if that's moving out of control, then you end up with demand for very big subsidies. Now, to be fair to the government at that time, they did know about supply and they did do their very best to get supply going again. And so in that sense, the Help to Buy scheme was very successful. Without that, I think supply would have struggled even more.
Yeah, I'm very interested in your take on Help to Buy, because it's an incredibly controversial policy in the housing community. And I full disclosure, I actually used Help to Buy. There's absolutely no way I would be a homeowner without it. And I think it's really important to point out that in its absence, there is a big problem in the market where people like me, maybe first-time buyers on middle incomes without huge amounts of cash from the bank of mum and dad, actually can't buy starter homes. I mean, obviously in London and the Southeast that skews because prices are so high. But for all of the flaws of Help to Buy, obviously it wasn't a perfect policy. I do think it has left a gap that no policy has been able to fill. I'm interested in what you hope that this commission will be able to look at. Would you just tell everybody what are the key things you'll be diving into are?
Housing is a very difficult subject because it's very easy for it to expand out into all sorts of areas. I realised that very quickly when I was working on housing supply. You may probably forgotten that alongside me, David Miles was working on recommendations about long-term mortgages. And to some extent, of course, we have got much longer-term mortgages. Perhaps his review was rather more successful than mine. We're really trying to focus in. I mean, Ben set it out at the beginning that the focus of this commission is mostly around the fact that there is a shortage of housing. So we're really looking at why has housing supply not picked up? What can we do around the planning system, around land availability to try to move housing supply up? And that's going to mean looking back at some of the issues I talked about 20 years ago in terms of the planning system, the proper resourcing of the planning system. Sometimes I'm painted as being against planning. I'm absolutely not against planning. In some ways, I think should be clear, if I want to join up with infrastructure, I think we need more planning, not less, because we need a much clearer context of what the housing is we're putting into place, why we're putting it there, how we're going to service it, how we're going to build communities. All that needs really good planning. So I would describe that as the main strand of our work. We're also interested in an issue which, frankly, 20 years ago, I probably didn't see coming, which is the issue of retrofit. And actually, that again has got worse, because 20 years ago, there was quite a move to change the regulation of housing new builds so that it did meet much more stringent standards on, for example, water usage, or indeed on the way in which it was heated. Not all of those proved to be very easy to carry out. But because we then took away I think it was called Sustainable Home Standard. I very much dislike the word sustainable because it gets overused so much. But having done away with that standard, we've now added another 10 years of housing to the stock, which doesn't really meet the right standard. So the retrofit problem has got even bigger, and it's also very often a very difficult issue to resolve for flats. So we are trying to take a look at that and how government could move forward with that, because that is also an incredibly urgent issue. Of the other issue we're looking at, the one I think I draw attention to is thinking about specialist housing, whether or not we can help if we have more suitable housing for older people to move into.
And that absolutely is going to be a growing issue in years to come. I'm working on a story at the moment about the growing number of older private renters. These are people who probably will never be able to buy homes of their own. And of course, if you live in a home owned by a landlord and you eventually need a stair lift put in, that's an enormous challenge. And I don't think anybody's quite grappled with it yet. So it's great that you're going to be looking at it. And on the need to build housing, on housing supply, we know that Labour have said if elected, they will build 1.5 million homes over the first term. Now, that is a big number. They haven't specified exactly how much of that will be affordable social housing. I'm really interested to see. The Conservatives, of course, have scrapped their target of 300,000 a year, which I believe actually originated in your 2004 review, or at least came about soon after. Do you think we're getting it right in terms of numbers? And how many homes do you think we should build? How many is it feasible to build?
Those are two really different questions. So the 300,000 number actually doesn't really appear in my review. If you had asked me at the time, I would probably have said 250,000. And interestingly, I also think that I would have expected that by the time we got to this point, there wouldn't be the need to add the supply so much. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that I didn't expect migration to continue to be so high, and undoubted, and migration is, of course, a really important factor behind the population growth that we expect over the next 15 years. If you look at the ONS numbers, they expect population to rise by 6.6 million over the next 15 years. 6.1 million of that is due to migration. It's not due to the internal domestic population growth. So migration, and I don't think I had the sense to foresee that we were going to need so much migration going forward. The 300,000 figure came about, I think, partly because people saw that we'd had this big dip, obviously, in house building. So they wanted to introduce the 300,000, not just for ongoing, but also to try and catch up. And of course, we've never managed to reach it. We have managed, with the benefit of conversions, some of which are of dubious quality. You referred to office conversions earlier. We have managed to get the number up above 250,000, but we've never managed to get to 300,000. So while I think the Labour aspiration to 1.5 million is extremely, I think that's an extremely good aspiration, it's going to be very, very difficult. It's going to be very difficult to do. I referred earlier to the point that it's not that easy just to turn the taps on again for a whole bundle of reasons, not just around skills. If you're going to try and get to 1.5 million by the end of the 5-year period, that probably means you're going to have to be above 300,000 towards the end of the period. And somehow you're going to have have found the people to build them and got the planning through. So this is a really Herculean task, and thinking about planning and where plans are and how you can speed up the delivery of the plans that are in place is going to be very important for the Labour government.
Absolutely. And indeed, I mean, it's something that the Conservatives have really had to grapple with. Now, former Housing Secretary Michael Gove was trying to get through some very interesting planning reforms, but he wasn't able to because the Conservative backbenchers didn't want compulsory planning at a local level. Do you think that NIMBYism is a more potent force in our politics today than it was when you did your 2004 review?
I should apologise for the aeroplane noise. I'm lucky enough to have a glass roof, so I need the door open, and I'm also lucky enough to live on the flight path to Stansted.
Infrastructure.
I'm not sure. I think yeah, it's nice to have it. I'm not sure. I think NIMBYism is more potent than it was then. It was really potent then. My feeling is it's remained much the same, but it may have actually increased. I've banged on about infrastructure and the difficulty, the failure to plan infrastructure alongside housing. Personally, I think that's, if anything, got a little bit worse rather than better. We had John Armitage from the National Infrastructure Commission really bemoaning the way in which we've handled infrastructure over the last few years, when he was able to still speak out ahead of the announcement of the election. And that is only going to make NIMBYism worse, because if people can see that their roads are more crowded, that they're more worried about their water infrastructure, that they can't get an appointment with the dentist, they are going to blame people who've moved into the area rightly or wrongly, and they're going to be more resistant to see new people moving into the area. But of course, some of these problems are not really to do with the housing crisis. They're to do with something more fundamental about the way in which we've been planning for a rising population, or possibly failing to plan for a rising population over a number of years.
Absolutely. And I would just say it is possible to build homes and infrastructure at the same time. I don't know why we seem to not be able to manage it, but I was recently in Cornwall visiting a new garden village called Langarth, and they are building geothermal power station, GP surgery, 2 new schools, as well as lots of new homes. It can be done, but I think it just needs to be a 360 approach, rather than what I see in my area often is buildings go up, but no new GP surgeries appear. No more trains are running into the centre of London. And of course, that is going to create issues. So I think we'll welcome the findings of this review as to how we can do everything a bit better in years to come. So there are lots of questions for you, Kate. I'm going to kick off with one. This is from Connell Boyle. How do we stop house prices rising?
That certainly is a $24 question. And I'm not going to be cheap and say, actually, if we had more supply, they wouldn't rise so fast. But it nevertheless is a factor. If you, I mean, people often say that they simply don't see a connection between housing supply and prices. And I always invite them to have a thought experiment. Supposing whoever is elected and becomes the housing secretary in the new government stands up and says, we're not going to build any more houses. What do you think would happen to house prices? They would rise immediately because people's expectations would be that house prices were going to get more expensive and there'd be a terrible scramble to acquire houses. Now, in a lesser sense, because we always think there may not be enough houses and that we think house prices are going to rise, we sort of scramble people into taking the home ownership decision. I mean, you talked about people struggling to get into home ownership. I can actually see a slightly different problem. Because people think house prices are going to rise, they often are desperate to move into home ownership at a point when perhaps for their life, for their life ambitions, they would be better off staying in the rented sector for a little bit because they're not quite ready to take on all the responsibilities of home ownership. And they may want to, they may be really wanting to move again, and moving when you have home ownership becomes more expensive, stamp duty, estate agents' fees, lots and lots of things. So I often think back to the early 90s when we had a period of relative house price stability. And I happened at the time to be in charge of a department of people. I had a lot of relatively young people, and they just didn't feel this pressure to buy because they didn't feel the market was moving away from them. So I think change, if you are strong about increasing supply, that would help you to change people's expectations about what's going to happen in the housing market. And that would in itself tend to mean that house prices wouldn't rise quite so quickly.
It's really interesting. And absolutely, I remember the 2010s when house prices were skyrocketing and everybody I knew was desperate to buy because they thought they'd make lots of money. That's not really a reason to buy. And having bought, I can say it's not exactly a walk in the park, actually. Here's another question. This is from Chris Poynton at Cambridge Climate Energy. Do we have a housing problem or a job location problem? How could a more evenly distributed economy help alleviate housing issues?
One of the economic issues, this isn't necessarily to do with the housing market, that I've been particularly concerned with over the last few years is what's sometimes called levelling up. So my hometown is actually Stoke-on-Trent, a place which could do with some levelling up if anywhere could. And if you go back, sometimes when I go back and look there, you can see, that people's incomes are not very high, so they really struggle to buy new housing. And I think that brings out very clearly the point in here. If you had more better paid jobs in Stoke-on-Trent, you would be able to build more houses and build them at a higher price point, so that you were selling into a different market. I note, however, because I was looking at these numbers this morning, that when you talk about under occupation, as people often do as part of the issue here, outside London, under occupation, people who live in a house where they've got more bedrooms than the bedroom standards, under occupation is pretty similar across all the regions. It's very low in London, where people do tend to kind of, as it were, squeeze up. Outside of London, there's not much difference between, say, the east of England, where I am, and the north and the northwest. So it's not necessarily the case that we've got somehow lots of supply sitting waiting to be occupied in these places. But I completely agree that we are selling ourselves short because we aren't doing more to develop our cities and to ensure that there are good jobs there, which, as the question rightly implies, means that people would be keener to put new supply in.
Absolutely. And you talked about over-occupation and under-occupation, which leads nicely into this question from Andrew Dixon of Fairer Share. He says, given the punitive stamp duty and regressive council tax, there is a very real impediment to and no incentive for older generations to downsize. Do we face a genuine housing shortage, Or is it a case of the wrong families living in the wrong homes? And is tax reform part of the solution?
I think at this point, I'm tempted to give a plug for a report which I didn't write, which is the report that was done by Tony Crook and Christine Whitehead, both of whom I know well, for the Family Building Society, where they did talk about this issue. One thing I would say about that report is that when they make the comment about trying to share the housing stock out better, they preface it by saying an increase in supply is absolutely necessary. But they're making the point that that may be quite long term. And in the short term, perhaps there are things we can do to make our use of the existing stock more efficient. And in particular, they talk about the growth of second homes and the growth, which has certainly occurred in a lot of areas, of more people doing short-term lets, leisure lets. And those are areas I think you could well address. The problem of older people, and I've already commented on the fact that we're wanting to look at this particularly in the report, the ability to supply housing which older people would find they wanted to move to, is a very good point. We have a lot of old people who live on their own in houses which are probably no longer suitable, and the difficulty of persuading them to move or helping them to move is quite great. Now, I feel this particularly. I'm 66, my husband is 65, so I sit listening to people telling me that I really should be moving, and I think, well, that's possibly true. My house only has 3 bedrooms, and to be frank, I rather need 3 bedrooms. And of course, people today, even when they are older, I always quite struck, people who discuss this often kind of talk about even the over 55s. Well, many people over 55, indeed over 65, are still working, and they will increasingly want a home office. So the pressure on the housing stock, and younger people also want home offices. So the pressure on the housing stock in terms of the rooms people want to make their houses really livable has probably grown in recent years. Now, I'm very much in favour of trying to think about ways to help older people when they really need to move. I think that's would be a great idea. And of course, there are very obvious points here, particularly around stamp duty. Stamp duty is a tax economists hate anyway, so many people would like to get rid of it altogether. But certainly trying to help older people to move and not feeling they're going to end up with stamp duty being a big part of the cost would be I think a positive feature. But the other thing, and you talked about this earlier, the difficulty for people in private rent of moving somewhere suitable. So it's not just homeowners, it's also private rented people. And we just haven't really given the thought to how we're going to have the right stock for all these people to move and be accommodated in places that are going to help them to live in their own homes for longer. I really do want this to be something that the review is able to make useful suggestions on.
Yeah, and that's great to hear, because I get lots of emails, not all of them particularly kind, about things that I've written. And one that comes up often is, well, just tell old people to move into old people's homes and then everything will be fine. And I don't think it's that simple at all. I also benefited personally from grandparents who had a spare room that I could stay in after university. And if they hadn't had that, I'm not sure where I would have gone. So I'm really pleased to hear a slightly more nuanced take on the situation. And something I think is also interesting and related to this, that it would be great if you have the time to look into in the review, is, so I'm 36 and I live in a 1-bedroom starter home now, which I bought through Help to Buy, as I mentioned. I would love to move and have a bit more space, maybe think about having children at some point in the near future. But I can't really afford to, and I wouldn't be able to afford to do it with stamp duty as well if I was then going to have to move again. So I think it's also blocking up the sort of bit of the market where people my age who were once upsizing aren't able to. And in my building, lots of my neighbours who are a similar age are cramming newborn babies and their partners into flats the same size as mine. So we're not upsizing either. And I think how tax could be reformed to make that easier as well, then you'd be looking at both parts of the market, because I'm not sure anybody's really looking at what's going to happen to my generation if we can't do what our parents did and buy homes to have families in. We've all bought these starter flats that aren't big enough.
You've raised a point there, which actually it in some sense goes back to Help to Buy. One criticism of Help to Buy was it encouraged people to buy bigger homes than they otherwise would have done. But personally, I thought that was a really rather a good thing, because it enabled a lot of people, clearly not you, but it did enable other people to move into homes as their first home that they could then think of raising a family in. Because you've just pointed out that if you move into a small home at the beginning, then the cost of moving on, if you don't get any more first-time buyer help, becomes much more difficult. So I think stamp duty interferes with both downsizing and upsizing. Now, whether getting rid of stamp duty altogether is feasible, you'd have to put the tax burden somewhere else in the housing system. It would require some thinking about. Stamp duty is also quite a helpful tax for managing the housing market. Cuts in stamp duty to encourage moves in a short time, or increases in stamp duty if you think the market is running hot. It's quite a good lever for government, the cyclical policy. But as a underlying a relatively high tax rate, I think it's really questionable, and a reform of stamp duty would be very useful. There's nothing like a personal story to bring that to life, and I can relate to it. My elder son is 36 and he's got just your problem.
Yeah, and of course, if Help to Buy had continued and I could use Help to Buy to move again, it would be a very different situation. And my sister did that. So she bought a starter flat, and then she and her fiance were able to use Help to Buy a 3-bedroom home where they have one child and they're going to have another. So that's another example of the problems that come with turning the taps on and off with policies rather than a long-term strategy. So another question we've got, this is from Alicia Weston. She says, it seems to me that the government's attitude to increasing support is to expect major house builders to deliver more and cut their margins. That's not going to happen with land in limited supply. What gives you hope?
Well, I wouldn't like to comment on whether it's actually government policy to ensure that house builders reduce their margins. But the fact that we are very reliant on a small number of large house builders for the bulk of our supply is an uneasy one. I think the loss of particularly the medium-sized builders from the market that we've seen, if you go back and look at the numbers, the loss of small and medium-sized house builders is really fearful. It's part of the sort of hollowing out of the residential industry that I've already talked about. But it's true. Our house builders going to reduce their margins only if they will only reduce their margins, since margins are kind of something that people are relatively enthusiastic about. If you have policies, particularly around the way in which land is handled and uplifts in land value are addressed, that mean that it makes it much more difficult for house builders to build big margins. But I think I'd like to draw a distinction here, because the profit really comes out of land. It comes out of the move of land. It doesn't come so much. If we had a different market, as some other countries do, where house builders much more take land that has already been to some extent improved and dealt with by government, and they were just building on it, the margins would be lower and the risks would be lower. So if you are going to think about changing the way in which our market works, the way in which house builders work, you would need to think about changing the way in which we deal with land and the profits made on land, and indeed the profits that landowners often make. And thinking about landowners, I think we all have this image in our mind of the landowner as a kind of terrible profiteering person, but often they're charities, schools, universities, companies who've got a bit of land that they would like to put into best use. And you can't take away all the incentive for that. Otherwise, they say, oh, I'll just keep it as a nice bit of land to look at. So you have to make sure you get the balance right between making sure that people don't make ultra profits from land transfer, but also that they don't make none. Otherwise, you've just said to people, oh, don't worry about developing your land.
Absolutely. And now we have a question from Dr. Toomey Hawkins, Cabinet Member for Planning in South Cambridgeshire. They ask, can government be encouraged to halt the right to buy scheme that is reducing the stock of council housing and preventing councils from being able to replace stock that is sold, as most of the proceeds go to the government?
Well, I've waxed reasonably lyrical about my regrets in the fact that the social housing stock has fallen. Clearly, part of the reason that social housing stock has fallen has been the right to buy. I don't think personally I would wish to stop the right to buy. The ability of people to buy their own home has been a sort of powerful mechanism, but it's had some ill effects long term. So we know that in many places, the people who did the original right to buy have then moved on, and the property is sometimes bought by private landlords, and that's had quite a detrimental effect on some estates where they haven't necessarily kept it going. And there have been other effects. So sometimes people have bought homes, but they haven't necessarily been able to cope with the upkeep. So it's made the whole estate more difficult to manage because you've got a bundle of people who are either not able or not willing to ensure that the property is kept up. And that's quite difficult for social landlords. The issue that really comes out of that question for me is what happens to the proceeds. If we're going to take the proceeds of social housing and not reinvest it, and we've seen the difficulties that Homes England has had in reinvesting in social housing over the last few years, then clearly I think that is a bad thing. We absolutely need to ensure that we don't just replace social renting stock, but in areas which really need it, we increase social renting stock so that people can have the benefits of a good landlord and security of tenure. That is so important to a lot of people.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure that right to buy has to exist in the way that it has done, where, properties end up in the hands of private landlords who rent them out to lower income tenants who rely on housing benefit, and then taxpayers' money is going to private landlords. But then there's a middle way, right? As you point out, between people being able to buy homes who want to and can keep them, and people who need social housing having social housing. And it's so often presented as a binary.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's quite difficult though, because you can't force people to stay in the social housing, I suppose. And it's quite hard to put permanent covenants on things to say this could never be a rented house. That would seem a bit odd. You could, I suppose, say actually you need to give first refusal when you move on to the housing place you've moved to, housing whoever it is that you have bought the house from.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a very interesting trial in Lambeth, I think, with money from Sadiq Khan doing a right to buy back scheme, and that was very, very effective. So there are ways around it without completely cutting the right to buy. Another question here. This is from Tom Rees. What are the economic spillover effects of the housing crisis on productivity, labour mobility, business formulation, etc.?
My goodness, I see. Obviously hoping for some kind of thesis. Can I say that also if people are going to, it's nice if anybody's got any ideas that they could bring these forward as well. It doesn't have to be all questions. It's harder than you might think to pin down what the effects on productivity have been. One very obvious effect in the past 20 years has been the enormous increase, and you referred to it earlier about going to live with your grandparents. Now, I don't know where your grandparents lived, but it strikes me very obviously that the higher number of people between 25 and 34 who've been living at home with their parents are going to be constrained in their job search because they're going to have to do job search near where their parents live. And indeed, again, this has been true in my family. My younger son lived at home until he was nearly 30, until he was nearly 31. COVID didn't help, but his job search was clearly constrained by the fact that he couldn't move that he couldn't really find, that he couldn't simultaneously find something that paid enough for him to move out. So we will almost certainly have lost productivity because we've had what economists would call more jobs mismatch. So people are sometimes doing jobs they're more skilled for, or doing jobs they're less skilled for, and companies have found it more difficult to find the right employees, particularly in places where house prices are high. I mean, Cambridge, London, Cambridge are very obvious examples of that. So in that sense, I think it has not helped with productivity. The fact that moving is difficult and expensive also doesn't help with productivity. And we talked a bit earlier about the gap between the north and the south. One of the ways in which the housing market doesn't help with productivity is if you're in a good job in the south and you're offered a job in the north and you think, oh, that's great, I can go there and I can buy a bigger house. And then you think, but I'll never be able to move south again because I'll have lost that ability to come back in the southern housing market. So you have all kinds of imperfections in the job market because of that. And when we think about company formation and investment, the housing market has sucked a lot of finance into it. I mean, actually, we're talking about the need for more finance, perhaps in social housing. But in general terms, people's desire to invest in the housing market and to see their house as a source of finance at old age is completely rational in one way, because you know you want a house to live in old age. But if you systematically stay in a bigger house because you're hoping to benefit from the gains of being in a bigger house, rather than putting more of your money into a pension, then you're skewing the way in which the financial markets work, and you're skewing the flows of investment, which might then feed down to smaller firms. There's a slightly different argument, which is that high house prices are good for small business formation because they are what banks use as security. I'm not entirely sure I think that's a very comfortable argument, because it suggests a lot of small business people are being forced to put their home at risk, which in a way might not be a very desirable thing.
Absolutely. And I suppose there's a slight add-on to that question that I'm interested to ask, which is, I keep hearing arguments about the fact that private renters, of which there are now 5 million households renting privately, spending more and more of their take-home pay on rent, so they have less to spend on other things. And if mortgage rates increase, particularly for young people who bought at the top of the market and took out big, 95% mortgages, their mortgage costs will take up a lot of their take-home pay. Does that have a knock-on effect for the economy as a whole if people have less disposable income?
Certainly it does. But if you sort of think about, you made the point about mortgage rates. When you're increasing interest rates, one of the things you want to do is stop people spending, actually. So it's not actually an unintended consequence. That's part of the way in which you want monetary policy to work. But I think you're making a different point, which is about the long-term trend that housing is taking more and more of our incomes. And here we often compare ourselves with other countries. And the Resolution Foundation has recently pointed out, not only do we spend a lot of our disposable income on housing, more than other countries, but we actually get less housing space for it. So we have less space per person than in other countries. So it's more expensive and worse value. So, and that actually goes a little bit against this argument about, oh, it would all be fine if we all just lived in the right sized house, because it suggests that actually we haven't really got a housing stock that's fit and suitable for the population we presently have.
Absolutely. And this is less of a question and more of a comment from Catriona Riddell, who is one of the commissioners, I believe. And she says, planning needs to be seen as a force for good. How do we tackle the NIMBYism, which just says we want more housing, just not here? I think that's a really interesting point from Catriona, because I personally think that the NIMBY-YIMBY debate, and journalists, by the way, bear a huge amount of responsibility for blowing this up and amping it up and publishing articles that reinforce the divide and the arguments. It seems to me that planning and building, as Catriona points out, does need a bit of rehab.
Totally. when you sort of, I mean, I live in a relatively large village, small town. It's actually classified as a town. We've had a lot of building in the last 10 or 12 years. And the benefit of that is that we still have lots of shops in the high street, pharmacies, grocers' shops, a very lively and well-attended primary school, and what I would describe as a thriving community. It's not clear to me if we hadn't got the new housing, we would have that thriving community. Increasingly, we would have become a place which was largely full of old people like me, kind of chugging along and bemoaning the fact that the shops kept closing. So we do need to be able to say, actually, in some places, putting in more housing will really help. It will change the population. It will enable your families to move near to you if that's what you want, or possibly you to move nearer to your family if you want to do that. Whereas if we're all kind of stuck in a very rigid housing stock, that's much harder for all of us to really experience our good news for housing. And Katrina's also right, because we can think of lots of areas near the middle of towns which are really failing. And actually, where good planning and thinking about how could we turn this area around, should we demolish one or two things? Can we change the use of this building so it's being better used as housing than as something else? And here I want to stress, I do not want bad quality conversions, but it is possible to have good quality. It is absolutely possible to have good quality conversions. It's just a bit more expensive. And then you can make an area that was failing into something that's thriving again. And that's certainly possible. And we do have quite a lot of examples around the country of places. I mean, Kelman Island in Sheffield is really bright and thriving. And I'm not sure you would have thought that was going to happen 20 years ago.
That's really interesting. And just on those conversions, you and I completely agree. I've been into some absolutely terrible office to residential conversions. And actually, I'm originally from Croydon, which is a place where there are a lot of permitted development right office to resi conversions that were not thought through. And this comes back to why I think it's so important that you're looking into infrastructure. If you turn what was once a massive BT office block into flats, but you don't put in any parks for children, you don't run more trains into the city centre, you just don't have housing that is fit for people to live in. And that's before you even get into the fact that the windows on this particular building do not open and it's not going to withstand climate change. A hill I will die on is that we really, really cannot have any more of these bad PDR conversions. There's probably time for one or two more questions. And I think a really interesting point has been made a few times by various people, which is this idea that relying on the private sector to build the homes that we need is problematic. Builders are struggling. How are they going to get it done? And I'm thinking again of my trip to Cornwall, and that garden village I mentioned was actually being built by Cormac, who are Cornwall Council's construction company. So they're doing it all in-house. It is a council-owned builder. Everything, the structural engineering, the infrastructure, it's all coming from the council with, I think they had some help from Homes England, actually. I think that's What do you think about more councils having their own builders?
One of the points that was very interesting in the recent Competitions and Market Authority review of the industry was exactly that we were that the reliance on private market housing hadn't worked. And you see it absolutely clearly if you look at the very familiar chart of what's happened to house building of different types. When the social housing build collapsed, you did not see a concomitant rise in private market housing. It absolutely tells you that you need the public sector to be more active in this sphere. And I'm very supportive of councils being able to do more building. I was interested to hear you say that Homes England had helped give that the right support. But some of this lies in what councils are going to do with their land. Many councils and many public bodies actually do have land. How are they going to use that? And are they really constrained by the need to get best value when they sell, so that they're not then using their land for best value, which is measured not just in pounds and pence, but in social terms, because you're building the right houses, you're getting people out of temporary accommodation, you're making your place better in an incredibly fundamental way. And if we don't think more about this, we're really going to miss the point of what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then finally, one last question I think we have time for, and this is something that has been coming up a lot in my research recently. I've been reading about how the national grid probably won't be able to cope with lots of new homes. And of course, Labour have pledged new towns if they are elected. And I was reading an article that said that there isn't the electrical supply for them. Water supply is also a big problem. What do you make of that? And is there a solution that you can think of, or is that something that will come out of the Commission's report?
I think this, frankly, is something that's going to come out of the Commission's report. I completely agree with it. It's not just new homes that the national grid isn't ready for. It's not really ready to supply all of the electric cars that we need to have, or indeed to supply all of the electricity we would need just to take the existing stock and increase the amount of electricity that people are probably going to use in the existing stock. So we face, and again, this came up earlier, we simply failed to do very much with our infrastructure. And I think this is uncomfortable. You talked earlier about the fact that people get their income taken up by housing. One of the problems now, when we're all saying, oh, we need more infrastructure, is in some sense we're going to try and force the economy of the country to move away from consumption towards investment. That's actually a really big ask. And perhaps one of the things that politicians on both sides in this election are not really being straightforward about is we are really going to have to invest more in public services and in infrastructure to fit us for the future and deal with climate change. And that means that means we may not all have so much fun going out to restaurants of any kind.
Well, that will win elections if they start talking about it. But I agree.
And that's why, exactly. And that is why that's why they don't. I'm not making a party political point here.
Absolutely. And indeed the cost of care and where the money is going to come from. And I think if we want to have the things that people need, being able to access your GP, being able to access housing, schools, then something has to give. But it's an incredibly poisonous political narrative, and nobody's brave enough to take it on. But I am heartened by some of the polling I've been looking at that shows that particularly since the pandemic, people do favour more spending. They'd rather have spending than tax cuts. That's really, really clear in all of the big polling. So perhaps voters are more across this than the people they're voting for realise.
Let's hope so. That would be good. Yeah. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. And I'll just hand back to Ben.
Look, can I just say a huge thank you on behalf of everybody on this call? And I think we've had about 90 people log on today. That was a real tour de force, and I fear that we've only just begun to scratch the surface, but you took us through a sort of huge range of issues. I know there will be people who are frustrated that they haven't managed to make their point or get it over. Don't worry. If you have a look on the Radix website, radixuk.org, you can find, or the Shoosmiths website, you can find how you can submit evidence to the Commission. You've got till the 1st of August, and we would very much like you to follow up the discussions. We don't need very long papers, just a couple of paragraphs setting out your thoughts and ideas. We'd really appreciate those. So do continue that discussion debate. Meanwhile, Radix Big Tent is delighted to be providing this platform. Do follow our blogs, do check out our website. And if you've enjoyed this discussion and you would like us to be able to do more of this sort of thing, please do make a donation. And again, you can find that on our website as a way of doing it. Lastly, just finally, we are so grateful with respect to all of our other commissioners, and we've got a wonderful lineup, which you can see on our website, to Kate for taking on this task. It will be very challenging. There is so much to cover, and we will have to focus quite specifically. But watch out for our report, which I very much hope will land at the point in the political cycle where it may just about be possible to do things which are slightly less popular, with 5 years to prove that they work. So let's continue the discussion, and thank you to everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Yes, goodbye,
Thank you
everyone.
so much. Bye. Thank you.